if you get comfortable enough with that discomfort, let's say not the good stress, right? But you get comfortable enough with that, it's more comfortable to be with what you know than what you don't know. And to step into what you don't know, yeah, can be scary.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, how much of our time do we spend, brooding over some element of the past and then projecting it into the future as some sort of negative anticipated memory? And then essentially building a brick house like a mason of anxiety.
But if we talk a little bit more about if what we can do now, like we can lean, you talk about if we can lean into discomfort, that can make us healthier. Where's that here? And also I'll just mention this one thing. You mentioned this term called hormesis, in your work, and maybe that you can kind of weave that into this because that's a interesting concept.
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe now we actually have to self-impose these Paleolithic stressors that mimic the conditions with which we evolved. So there is, as you mentioned, this concept of hormesis, which is a phenomenon that in relation to the right amount of stress, the body actually builds resilience, activates longevity pathways.
I'm Dr. Elisha Goldstein, and this is Emotional Longevity. My guest today is Jeff Krasno. Jeff is a writer, entrepreneur, and the founder of Commune, a platform dedicated to health, spirituality, and personal growth. He's also the host of the Commune podcast and the author of The Comfort Trap and the newly released book, Good Stress, which explores how rethinking stress can transform our health and longevity. For decades, Jeff has been at the forefront of conversations around wellness, mindfulness, and societal change. He's interviewed some of the world's leading thinkers in health, science, and spirituality, and his work bridges ancient wisdom with modern science to help people live healthier, more connected lives. His latest book, Good Stress, really flips the script on stress. And this is something we all need to hear. Instead of avoiding it, Jeff explores how we can use it to grow stronger, more resilient, and ultimately improve our health span and longevity. In this episode, we discuss why our modern world has made stress feel like the enemy, how our biology is wired to handle it, and why intentionally engaging with the right kinds of stress, whether through movement, cold exposure, fasting, or any kind of challenges in daily life, or even the tough conversations in our most intimate relationships, can enhance not just our longevity, but also our emotional well-being. This episode is one of my favorite conversations yet. Jeff doesn't just talk about theory, he really lives it. His personal journey from being diagnosed with chronic illness to reclaiming his health by aligning with the stressors our biology evolved to handle is both inspiring to me personally and also deeply practical. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by stress or unsure how to navigate it, this conversation will change the way you see it. You'll walk away with actionable tools to reframe stress, harness it for growth, and create a life that is both healthier and more vibrant. And now, my conversation with Jeff Krasno. Okay. Hey, Jeff. Welcome to the Emotional Longevity Podcast.
Hey, Elisha. Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
I love the premise of, I know you have the comfort trap out on audio and now Good Stress just coming out. I love the premise of this book because it aligns a lot with what I talk about on, in this podcast and just in general, how we can use and influence our emotional health for long-term well-being. What I find compelling it really is how you flip the script on stress, and instead of avoiding it, how we can use it. And so I want to talk about that a little bit just initially. Can you break down the idea of this to our listeners or those who are watching?
Yeah, sure. Sometimes I feel like I'm a PR agent for stress, trying to flip the script a little bit on it. Of course, our modern association with stress is generally quite negative and, justifiably. And there's reason for that. It's because modern stress is generally chronic, right? And it has all sorts of negative downstream impacts, both physiologically and psychologically. But if you really look at stress and the stress response that's baked into human engineering, it's actually completely adaptive. So I'm a denizen of the hills of Los Angeles, for example. I will go out on a hike generally before a podcast like this to clear my head. And on every harvest moon or so, I will run into like a rattlesnake on my little serpentine path that I walk on. And my body has a totally adaptive bottom up involuntary response to that experience. So, right, so my heart rate and my respiratory rate increase. My liver secretes just the right amount of glucose to send to my extremities to fight or flee. The aperture of my attention gets, super tight. I become self-obsessed and distrust the world around me. And that really serves my biological imperative to survive. And we've inherited that over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. The problem with modernity is that for so many people, the rattlesnake never slithers off the path, right? So we are in a constant state of emotional dysregulation. But if you stay with me on this metaphor for a second, the second that the rattlesnake determines that, Jeff Krasno will not be on the specials menu today and slithers off into the tall grasses, what happens? My body returns to homeostasis. So my heart rate and respiratory rate decrease, my aperture opens back up, and I move back into my parasympathetic state. And that is, of course, the normal way to do things. But in this day and age, there's not very much normal that's happening. We are in a constant state of being triggered, primarily because of the information environment, but for so many other reasons as well. So I'm really focused on how do we actually leverage stress for our benefit and essentially, sometimes I call it align with nature's current. Our body build all of these incredible adaptive responses to short-term Paleolithic stress. And the more that we can unpack those and now more or less self-impose those, the more we align ourselves with our core biology.
So I always understand that nothing natural to us is inherently good or bad, right? And like meaning it's not inherently one or just the other. And so you're illuminating like, okay, so we have natural responses. Obviously, there's some element of it that's good, but that's not part of the story that we tell. And so you're beginning to tell that story. You had an experience a little while ago where you were, and you talk about this in the beginning of the book. There was kind of a moment of reckoning where you were diagnosed, like you say, 6 in 10. I think the statistic you say 6 in 10 Americans receive kind of some kind of chronic disease diagnosis, which is such a big 60. That's a huge amount.
Yeah.
And so you received this diabetes diagnosis. How did that moment for you? A lot of people, I would say, in that moment might kind of fall into the more negative stress response or bad stress, we might say, and not harness it. But how did you begin to use it as a way of exploring the concept of good stress?
Yeah, well, initially, my foray into health and wellness was a product of intellectual curiosity, and then quite suddenly became sort of a physiological necessity. As you mentioned, yeah, 4 or 5 years ago, I was experiencing all of these different symptoms that are so common and anodyne in our society. So yeah, brain fog, chronic fatigue, insomnia, kind of a little additional adiposity around the middle, what I call dad bod, right? You know, gynecomastia, the clinical term, and my children love to say, "Dad, you have man boobs," etc. These kinds of things.
We'll call it a father figure.
Fa fair enough. Yes, I was fitting the model exemplar of the father figure. Um, and, of course, we've normalized those presentations in our society. But if you look over the course of human history, all of those presentations are incredibly abnormal. And they sit right upstream from what we label as disease. And so, of course, for me, I slapped a continuous glucose monitor on my triceps. This is just this little disc for people who are not watching on video that you can self-apply, and it will bounce its data dutifully to an app and give you a window into your blood glucose levels moment to moment. And lo and behold, I stared into that app and oh my God, I had, a number that might not mean much to your audience, but 125 milligrams per deciliter fasting blood glucose, which is on the highest end of prediabetes and lowest end of diabetes. And as a typical male, I had canceled my PCP appointment like 3 years running. But then I was like, I better keep this appointment and went in and, got a battery of tests. And lo and behold, not only was I chronically fatigued and insomniatic, but I also had a diabetes diagnosis and to boot, a gut as leaky as a rusty old pipe. So, but of course, that did not make me extraordinary. As you mentioned, that makes me essentially ordinary as an American.
That's very
Yeah, which is nuts. 6 in 10, as you said, people in the United States, adults, are nursing one chronic disease, and 40% are nursing two different chronic diseases. And of course, it is our custom to never really address the root causes of those diseases in our modern allopathic Western medicine system. We generally, treat those symptoms with cocktails of pharmaceuticals that essentially mask just the presentations, but never really deal with root cause. So that was, it's all nice to say, but that was my visceral reality. And, I had to approach that with honesty and a lot of self inventory to really make significant changes in my life. And I began to, explore a whole variety of different protocols as a product of a lot of interviews and research and N-of-1 experimentation. But there was something deeper that had to happen first, candidly, that was much more psychological and kind of almost, dare I say, spiritual, or, I had to emotionally regulate and take a deep look inside the story that I had scaffolded about myself, that I had, lugged forward like a rucksack into my kind of adulthood from childhood. And I needed to really do that, take that sort of biopsychosocial intake form for myself before I could actually like get into a cold plunge or start fasting or do all of these other kooky things that I started doing.
which by the way I love. I know follow your social stuff and how genuine you are of kind of like just showing yourself in these different things, whether it's whether it's the cold plunge or whether it's any of these kind of modalities that you're using to support your body. I want to go a little bit deeper if you can, because this is fascinating to me and is at the cornerstone of even a book I'm writing at the moment, which is understanding that when it comes to longevity, we do typically think about in our health span, we do typically think about our exercise, nutrition, and sleep, which are all essential, right? So essential, and then the um, our emotional health, kind of stress, relationships, life satisfaction, comes kind of it's second. It's not like as it's not where it's not where the money's poured into as much.
Mhm.
And the argument is that that's sort of like the cornerstone, to some degree, because when that's going well, these other things are easier. Can you talk a little bit about your personal experience when you did that kind of deep dive, for yourself? Like, what was the aha or the impact that had when you kind of like did that emotional inquiry?
Yeah. Well, I sort of had two simultaneous parallel inquests going on at the same time. One that was, quite spiritual and psychological, and then one that was like highly physiological. And, those two separate inquiries kind of converged. And sometimes I think about the medicine bridged with the mysticism, if you will, or kind of the hard empirical Western science started to reveal kind of these like metaphysical truths that you often can see patterned in physiology or in nature, etc. So this was just to give a little context to my journey in that respect. You know, for me growing up, I was a super chubby kid, and I had a very peripatetic upbringing. So I was living all over the world, being lugged around by my parents, and this subjected me to like wonderful cultural influences and lots of different languages. But as a kid, your primary instinct really is just to make connection, is to fit in, right? And I was being moved to a new school in a new language with new cliques of friends every 4 to 6 months for years and years. And essentially, in retrospect, what I started to understand about myself is that I would sacrifice any and all authentic aspects of Jeff Krasno in order to fit in and be liked. And of course, this in the moment was an adaptive response to my environment. Um, but over time, what it led to was um, a well, to incessant people pleasing and into a story that I began to tell about myself, that essentially I was just a chubby kid that would do anything to fit in, and that my value was completely anchored to what others thought of me. And, so many of us, I think, can relate to that kind of feeling about ourselves. And I really needed to begin to tell a new story about myself. And this is where a lot of kind of my awakening came really from kind of understanding that about myself and then learning more about physiology. And, I grew up in this kind of era of genetic determinism, right? That like, oh, my chubby destiny was just written in the stars of my genetics. Um, but as I began to kind of unpack more about my own physiology, I learned that no, you know, I didn't just have the thrifty gene, that was very useful in a famine for hundreds of years, and, really um, not particularly useful on Instagram or whatever. I was, I was, that really my organism is not a fixed thing. It is, as the Buddha intuited without the luxury of, you know, an electron microscope, it is completely impermanent and changing moment to moment in relationship to its environment. And I had much more agency, over that process than I ever thought. And I started learning about epigenetics. I started learning about neuroplasticity. I started learning about the microbiome, all of these kind of 21st century ideas that sort of unveil the impermanence of the human body. And this was kind of both scary on some level, but incredibly empowering, because I had really much more agency over the trajectory of my health than I ever thought I did. And this was sort of the springboard then for me to begin to, explore, particular protocols that, really turned my life around.
You mentioned a second ago that you said it was scary in some way,
Mhm.
but to understand those. Can you just share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, coming to that realization that your existence, your organism, is not a product, but a process that's always in flux, really, in some ways, violates our sense of identity. I mean, Elisha wakes up in the morning and saunters over to the mirror in the bathroom and, flexes his big pecs or whatever. And
Course, every morning.
Or every morning. And he's like, there's Elisha. There's a stable, reliable you
Yeah.
that is underwritten by this physical and psychological continuity, right? And you're more or less the same guy that you were yesterday and the day before that. But of course, anytime we page through a photo album, there's the cherubic baby of Elisha. There's the, you know, uh, malodorous teenager of Elisha. There's this like very distinguished denizen of middle-aged Elisha. Which one are you? You're none of them, right? You are essentially a process. But being a process feels on some level unmoored, right? Because I want to feel as there as if there is a distinct Jeff, with a locus of consciousness, like crouching like a tiger somewhere here behind my eyes, that is in control of things, if separate from things. And so the scary thing about processes is that, a process can go wrong, right? So, we often, too often, I guess I would say, associate health with downward spirals. One thing happens and that dominoes into another and into another. And all of a sudden we find ourselves at rock bottom. We have multiple chronic diseases. We're taking, multiple therapeutics, etc. But what I found was that upward spirals are just as possible as downward spirals. And that's the empowering, piece of being completely impermanent. I mean, it's quite amazing when you actually look at what you are truly made of. You're 7 octillion atoms experiencing 37 billion chemical reactions per second, right? There is literally nothing stable about what it is like to be you. And awakening to that is, again, I think a little bit jarring, but in the end, very empowering.
Yeah, and then that we are wired for certainty. That makes us feel
Mm,
comfortable to have
yeah.
things certain. And when you step into this idea that, oh, I'm a process, it's like I have a particular identity. I mean, this is why people get stuck in, sometimes anyway, get stuck in anxiety or depression or even their trauma when there's an identity with I'm this person. To be able to step outside of it and heal means if you get comfortable enough with that discomfort, let's say not the good stress, right? But you get comfortable enough with that, it's more comfortable to be with what you know than what you don't know. And sometimes you know
100%.
what you don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, how much of our time do we spend, brooding over some element of the past and then projecting it into the future as some sort of negative anticipated memory, and then essentially building a brick house, like a mason of anxiety, that we become anxious about our anxiety, and then we become anxious about the anxiety related to the anxiousness. And like all of a sudden, that's where we are. We're never here. We're never now. We're off in the past or projecting that past into the future. And so, this is why I guess again, it is a little scary to really realize that you are nothing but like a flame or a waterfall. You're sort of recognizable day to day by your form, but there is nothing stable to you. And so you exist in this sort of dynamism. And, the best thing you can do is foster a kind of dynamic homeostasis or equilibrium, and essentially that capacity to continually move back to center in all areas of your life, both psychologically and physiologically. And that's kind of where I really landed, was that the signature of health in every system is equilibrium. In psychology, we talk about coming back to center, right? Or in economics, the healthiest system is a strong, thriving middle class, looks like a bell curve. Or in politics, a strong middle where there's common ground and compromise. Or ecology with like biodiversity and a balance of species. But it's certainly in human physiology, we call that homeostasis. And the body is sort of riddled with adaptive techniques and responses to foster that homeostasis, from pH balance to blood sugar balance, to oxygen, carbon dioxide balance, to hormonal balance, to neurotransmitter balance. Everywhere you look, basically, is an exercise in balance. But then we lop on sort of these, the conveniences of modernity, and they often create imbalances. And imbalances are really manifestations of disease, or I would say maybe the other way around. Disease is really the manifestation of imbalances, whether you're talking about diabetes or heart disease, etc.
let's dive into this because this gets at the center of the work that you're doing right now, comfort trap and the good stress, and um, this idea that chronic ease in some way that this of modernity eliminates these natural stressors, and how this in turn is maladaptive for us in some way, and then we don't get the our bodies we don't get the ability to fight what's there because they don't have the buildup of these that work. And like, say more about that because I think that's a little different, something we're not as aware of, and so I think it's important to hear.
Yeah, well, I'll start with this statement is that, the epidemics of chronic disease that we are experiencing in our society are not bugs in the system. They are actually the normal and expected results of this Paleolithic genome that we share, simply trying to cope with our environment. And so we evolved as humans, as Homo sapiens over hundreds of thousands of years, but even for millions of years as hominids before that. Evolved in relationship to our environment. And that environment at some times was stressful. There was food scarcity. There was exposure to massive fluctuations in temperature. There was total immersion in nature, which essentially regulated our circadian rhythm. We woke with the sun. We didn't sit in comfy chairs or wear big, comfy shoes. We certainly couldn't order up Chick-fil-A on an app and have it here by the time, we finish this podcast. We also lived in deep community. This notion of kind of like single family comfort was nowhere to be found. So if you really examine I'll say this, if you were to map the entirety of human history over the course of a day, the characteristics that I just outlined were the signature of how we lived for 23 hours and 54 minutes of it. It's really since the Industrial Revolution and really accelerating in the last 50 to 70 years that we've essentially engineered our culture at every turn, and often in the name of profit, for comfort and ease. And those artifacts of comfort and ease really hijack our biology. They render these adaptive mechanisms maladaptive. So, for example, the Green Revolution in, post-World War II was a very noble idea, this idea that we're going to provide enough calories for a burgeoning population. The problem is that we went away from eating, like, for example, whole foods that were characteristic of our diet for, our entire history, to eating a refined, ultra-processed diet full of shelf-stable, nutrient-deficient stuffs that we could essentially get at any time. That was wonderful because it provided a lot of calories. But what we ended up denuding from our lives is a important degree of scarcity. So, for example, the body was engineered to be a little bit fat at the right times of year, right? So in the late summer, early fall, we would gorge on figs and other, generally things that have a lot of carbohydrates and glucose, and we would store a little bit of energy in the form of fat. And that was totally adaptive because our bodies knew that the paucity of winter's fallow was essentially just around the corner. But now we live in an era denuded of that stressor. We live in an era where kind of winter never comes in terms of food and calories. And so our body is simply doing what it's supposed to do. It just keeps storing fat for a winter that never comes. And then you look around and you scratch your head and you say, well, why is there 45% obesity rate? Well, it's right there. Essentially, our culture has hijacked our biology. And there's like hundreds of examples of that.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a quick break to check in and talk about a program that's very important to me. I've been working with people for over 20 years, and in that time, what I've realized is that uncovering emotional healing, Strengthening emotional health and building resilience works best when we're learning practical skills that are evidence based, supported by a caring community, and have access to daily guidance and support. That's why I built my emotional health coaching program. If you're someone who's ready to take your emotional health to the next level, you're tired of yo yoing around, you want to start really making real progress, whether it's building resilience, managing stress better, or simply feeling more balanced, you can get a free consult for the program. Just click the link in the description below to schedule your session and learn how we can support you. Now, let's get back to the episode.
So, in some way, what I'm hearing you say, Jeff, is that our body is built to adapt to these challenges that are here. It's and we've through our own society and culture over the past like many decades have made it so that there's not as much scarcity, there's not as much discomfort in that way. And so, but if we talk a little bit more about if what we can do now, like we can lean, you talk about if we can lean into discomfort, that can make us healthier. Where's that here?
Yeah, well, what
And also,
I
I'll just
yeah,
mention this one thing. You mentioned this term called hormesis, in your work, and maybe that you can kind of weave that into this because that's a interesting concept.
yeah, absolutely. So I believe now we actually have to self-impose these Paleolithic stressors that mimic the conditions with which we evolved. So there is, as you mentioned, this concept of hormesis, which is a phenomenon that in relation to the right amount of stress, the body actually builds resilience, activates longevity pathways. So essentially, it's stress that confers a psychological or physiological benefit. And there's many, many examples of that. Now, if you look at like what we're doing right now, Elisha, we're basically sitting in a comfortable chair that makes no use of our back muscles, that puts an improper angle between our torso and our hips and our knees, which will eventually tighten our hip flexors and make us inflexible. We don't use any other leg musculature, for example. We're probably sitting in a nice, well, at least I am, in a temperature regulated environment. There's a nice digital thermostat on the wall. Again, this makes very, very poor use of my evolutionary advantages. And I think this is kind of the ironic thing that now we actually need to push our edges of discomfort to fully optimize our human metabolism, our human immune system, our human cardiovascular system. So, for example, self-imposition of like thermodysregulation, pushing yourself to get a little bit cold or pushing yourself to get hot. Well, the dose makes the poison, right? You don't want hypothermia or hyperthermia. Those can be quite dangerous. But the right amount of cold and the right amount of heat align with our engineering. So what happens when you get very, very, very hot? Well, your body has this beautiful adaptive mechanism called sweating. We perspire, and what does that do? That brings us back down into the Goldilocks zone of 98.6, because our body is engineered for the warm porridge. We always are trying to find this dynamic homeostasis. The interesting thing is that the more that we push ourselves to get hot, it seems to create all of these other benefits, cardiovascular benefits. It also stimulates the production of all these interesting proteins like brain-derived neurotrophic factor that maintains the functionality of neurons. It produces this, what's known as heat shock proteins that maintain the three-dimensional shape and the functionality of other proteins. It produces endorphins. It basically unlocks our internal pharmacy. Endo is from endogenous. Orphine is from morphine. It's an opioid. So essentially what we're doing when we get into a sauna, for example, or a sauna blanket, or make ourselves hot in some other ways through subjection to climate, we are actually stimulating the production of these endogenous opioids that make us feel high, for example. So same thing with getting cold, for example. you get very, very, very cold. Your core body temperature plummets. And then what happens? Your body jumps into thermogenesis to essentially raise your core body temperature back into that Goldilocks zone. And it does that through using energy substrates like fat and carbohydrates and burning them in your mitochondria to make heat. And then it's also releasing all sorts of dopamine for a protracted period of time. There's all these other physiological benefits to it. But really, when we sit in a thermoneutral environment, we become less able to essentially come back to center, to thermoregulate. So we start losing that ability. So that's why it's so important to self-impose these different kinds of stressors, because then we're really taking advantage of our engineering. Like sitting, for example, I try not to sit for too long for a whole bunch of different reasons. Obviously, sedentariness is a sedentary lifestyle is going to lead to sarcopenia, and you're not going to burn as much calories, etc. But I've started to actually sit in a resting squat as much as I can, because really, what does that do? It mimics the way that I evolved. It actually then uses my core strength, my leg strength, my flexibility. It enhances my flexibility, etc. And so these, are just part of the protocols that now I call good stress, a sort of amalgam of different things that I try to self-impose in order to align myself with my core evolutionary engineering.
Yeah, I've experimented with these kind of like these types of things too, whether it's a cold plunge, or whether it's sauna, or whether it's doing I imagine actually even doing things like in the emotional health arena, even doing things like having difficult conversations, like what
Hmm.
what makes us create a little bit of friction and create a little stress that could actually enhance our life. Um,
That's right.
Talk about that a little bit, because I think you also talk about that, about difficult relationship or having difficult conversations. I think this is this is, to me, connections at the epicenter of well-being. It makes sense when you make the analogy between like nature and different things. It's like if you have a net and the net is strong, if you have strong connection, you feel safe and you tend to feel well. If the connection is frayed, like in your relationship, if you're in like a partnership or in friendships, or even at work, if the connections feel frayed, you feel a little bit you feel unsafe in that way. But having the vulnerability, or to have a difficult conversation that maybe you feel like on the other end of that is being um, left. Like I know for me, I'll give you an example. Like back to that emotional inquiry that you did. In my growing up, my parents divorced when I was 6 years old, so I had this kind of whole abandonment thing. So
Hmm.
in relationships, if I feel like I'm aware of this now, but in relationships, there's a difficult conversation to be had, and I feel like on the other end of it is emotional abandonment in some way. I'll feel an aversion to that, and it might be implicit or unconscious, and I might go do other things, like I'd rather scroll on my phone, or I'd rather do really anything but have that conversation. But on the other end of that conversation, I think is some of this good stress you're talking about. Speak about relationships a little bit and about that experience, 'cause I think a lot of people can relate to that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing that too about yourself. And, in the same way that we tend to avoid physiological stressors, we also tend to want to avoid psychological or emotional stressors. It's just not comfortable. So we evade them. But just in the same way that there are miraculous benefits to subjecting yourself to some physiological stress, there is some unbelievable benefits that sit on the other side of confronting emotional stress or relational stress. And, this is really, you know, where I started to try to apply, these adversity mimetics that are generally associated with physiology to relationships. So what does having stressful conversations look like? How can we actually develop the protocols that help us lean in to having those hard, thorny conversations? Because you can only imagine what lies on the other side of those. And in many ways, I think, the world our hearts know is possible is on the other side of having these really hard, stressful conversations. And of course, we live in an environment where relationships are often digital and people can anonymously hide behind keyboards and engage in, you know, warfare digitally, anonymously, and just essentially, hurl vitriolic barbs at each other all day long, right? But this, again, is in direct confrontation to how we evolved. It's not that we never had difficulties with each other. It's just that, for hundreds of thousands of years, we lived in tribes where we had to face each other and compromise and talk it through and work it out. So in many ways, again, we need to, reinstantiate those conditions with which we evolved. So for me, this became a really central part of my journey into excavating the nature of stress. Um, I don't want to give you too much context because it'll take too long, but over the course of 2020, in the fall of 2020, I ended up having 26-hour-long Zoom calls with people that didn't agree with me about one thing or another. And, this was initially very, very hard for me to do, given my personal history as a people pleaser. I was getting emails and, DMs and stuff from people that had taken real issue with something that I had said or written and had not hesitated to hold back their opprobrium, often in the form of expletives. So, but sometimes thoughtfully. And I built what I call my psychological immune system during this period. So very much how we build our physiological immune system through kind of low grade exposure to pathogens, viruses, and bacteria, et cetera, such that like our B cells, spin up proteins that we call antibodies, and those antibodies neuter the antigens, et cetera. I was essentially building a degree of psychological immunity by low-grade exposure to some insult. So as I started to lean into this intentionally, yeah. As I started to lean into this process a little bit and have these, hour-long Zoom calls with folks, I really built kind of my own regimen, if you will, of nonviolent communication, and then subsequently studied it afterwards, like the actual Marshall Rosenberg stuff. But yeah, this was a period of tremendous personal growth that kind of arose from really engaging directly with people that shared an oppositional view. And yeah, I became better and better at it um, as the more and more I did it. And emotional regulation was kind of the centerpiece of it because you cannot engage in a stressful conversation if you do not have tools of emotional regulation, because you need to go into those conversations in sort of what you might call a ventral vagal activated state, but essentially like a emotionally regulated state. You need to create a set and setting that people feel is safe and trustworthy. And even your physical posture needs to be relaxed, such that you can kind of create this coherence or attunement, if you will, with the person that you're engaging. And there's a lot of other techniques kind of involved, with it, around listening and really listening to understand and not to respond. That's a very, very difficult skill that when you really excavate one's own behavior, generally we're forming our response or rejoinder to people before they've even finished talking. So really, being extremely mindful about listening and creating space, and by extension, making people feel really heard and seen. There's a lot of other really, I think, important techniques to it, like, seeking connection and not seeking agreement or solution. So many of us are just essentially trying to win people over to our point of view. But if we focus first on the areas of convergence that we have with other people, often kind of in our personal lives, our hopes, our losses, our dreams, we tend to then uncover a lot of common humanity with folks, and that can make these stressful conversations, just candidly much easier and allow for much more possibility of connection and success. You may not find solution or agreement, but you can find this other layer where, um, the reactivity is tempered. And then, there's other techniques that I played with. There's a one called steel manning, which is sort of this technique that's based upon the shoulders of straw manning. So we all kind of witness straw man arguments all day long in the political invective, right? So it's just sort of like easy to knock down a straw man through ad hominem attack or through distorting someone's position. But instead of doing that, steel manning is a technique where you actually reiterate the best parts of someone else's opinion that you disagree with back to them. Instead of rebutting it, you actually consider the best points of their argument. And this actually yields a couple of amazing impacts. A, they feel really heard and seen, right? And more willing to compromise and hear your point of view. But you also fortify your own position by having to consider the best parts of someone else's opinion. And again, we rarely do that. So becoming mindful of these techniques and then really leaning in to having the conversations that we tend to avoid because they're stressful, can really yield a lot of great results. And candidly, we're at this moment in our public discourse where we just can't seem to have any degree of conversation. So that's why I think this is really important societally, but also incredibly important personally, because, if you can have these stressful conversations with, people that you don't know, like the 26 people that I did in 2020, can you not have them with the people that matter most in your life? Like your parents, right? Mine are in their mid 80s. And can I not have that compassionate conversation, before it's too late to have it?
Your parents, like your partner, like your kids, like your friends. Uh, you know, um, you said so much in that window just now, that I was like, oh my God, we could easily have a whole podcast just about that, because that is such an important to me personally. It's very important, like in my own life. And I know, as you said, culturally and where we are as a society right now in our discourse. I mean, you've moderated dialogues with the Israeli Palestinian, on each side of the table, during the midst of this very intense conflict that's been happening here. So you've really been in this, but I want to just back up just for a second, because and uh what you did that most people don't do in this day and age, because we're so overwhelmed that we're just trying to kind of get to the next thing. And, it's like we're treading water to some degree. And I do believe it's because of the amount of information and the complexity of sources that we're attending to in any given moment. But you prepared. You took time to reflect and prepare. And you said, I had to do some of this emotion regulation in some way before I met with this person. I had to be aware of my values. My values is more connection versus disconnection. Can you just speak very briefly to, what were some of the emotion regulation things that helped you before coming into those difficult conversations? And what were and remind us again of some of the core values that you walked into it with? And I love the steel manning versus straw manning. We'll put a bookmark in that too.
Yeah.
That's a great attention. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because, I've been sort of a rickety meditator most of my adult life, or certainly my last 10 years. And my wife teaches breath work and is a yogi. So I have a lot of these um, modalities in my general orbit, but it was actually really interesting, Elisha. It was many of the physical adversity mimetics that I adopted that actually ended up building these emotional regulation capabilities.
Uh-huh.
And it's sort of slightly ironic. But of course, you jump into an ice plunge and what happens? Well, right, you gasp, and believe me, I hate the cold. I abhor the cold, and um, you know, for most of my life, just looking upon a snow-fed lake would send me into a panic attack. So, I'm not any kind of Superman here. Um, but when you get into the cold, your body has that involuntary stress response, that bottom up response, and you feel that epinephrine like coursing through your veins. I tend to feel it in my neck. It's going to overtake me and I'm going to have a panic attack, right? And then you have a brief moment available to you where you can apply top down conscious pressure on top of involuntary bottom up response, right? So sometimes you can do that with breath. Sure, you can actually engage in some sort of parasympathetic inducing breath where you have some long holds, but you can also leverage your prefrontal cortex, your neomammalian brain, your rational brain, your kind of locus of logic, etc., and know that you're okay, that you're in a 55 or 50-degree water and you're going to be okay, and you're going to apply that top-down rationality on top of bottom-up involuntary pressure. And that capacity that you can build in the ice water, for example, begins to then punctuate other elements of your life. It spills over such that when you confront an inevitable stressor, whether they be physical or emotional or psychological, you have some tools available to you. The same thing was true for fasting. I adopted like a 16-8 protocol, nothing fancy, no multi-day water fasts, etc. But because I consolidated all of my consumption of food in an 8-hour window, didn't mean that I didn't get a hankering, for some ice cream at 9 p.m. Right? Yeah. And so, but because I became a disciple to this fasting practice at 9 p.m., I couldn't just mindlessly wander over to the pantry. I actually had to examine the provenance, the nature of the hunger itself, and distinguish between whether or not that stimulus, that hunger, was a biological need or an emotional or psychological desire, right? And 99.999% of the time, it was a psychological desire, right? I've got plenty of stored energy here to function for probably a month. So I was just more or less eating my feelings. And that was the provenance of the hunger. And so adopting that fasting protocol really helped me cultivate the famous space between stimulus and response that is often attributed to Viktor Frankl. So in that space, there's a choice. In that, choice lies our freedom, right, and our liberation. So again, that physical practice gave me this space where that again began to kind of punctuate other elements of my life where, I have 3 daughters. They love to aggravate me, but, if I could apply that space to their obstreperous annoyance, um, then I could actually, instead of being reactive, I could respond properly and kind of think for a second, be like, okay, what is the origin of their behavior right now? What is the most appropriate response? So, it was interesting. And of course, there is no separation between the body and the mind. And I found that a lot of these physical practices had very potent psychological attributes. And this really helped me jump into the ice bath, if you will, of stressful conversations. Because anytime that someone would say something that would probably have triggered me a few years ago, I could remain very placid, or at least emotionally regulate. Maybe I would have an immediate knee-jerk reaction to it, but very, very quickly I could bounce back to center, sort of as a Weeble Wobble does, right? If you remember Weeble Wobbles. And so this was, really key. And then in terms of values, you know, my values are, I guess they're sort of Buddhist in nature. What I am really trying to um, promote within my own community is this sense of, karuna, of compassion, of the identification of someone else's suffering as your own, if you will, with a call to action to alleviate that suffering. Can we find that sort of deep feeling within ourselves um, of compassion? Can we also find that with joy? In Sanskrit, it's mudita, just feeling joy for someone else's joy. And that seems simple, but in this era of the attention economy, the persuasion economy, where all you do is stare into your phone and you see sort of false reality of other people's wonderful, incredible lives, and compare yourself against that, such that someone else's success is not something to be celebrated, but instead you project your own unfulfilled potential onto that person, right?
Deficiency trap, right?
Yeah. And so, these were some of the kind of the core values that I was trying to embody and share as I was leaning into these conversations.
And one of the things I pick up from what you're saying is how the physiological interventions or practices in your life, what you've been able to do, and even in relationships, is kind of reframe a genuine mindset around like this is building my psychological immune system by doing this, because it creates a certain environment of which I then know that I want to apply something that's going to bring you back into homeostasis, and therefore my brain gets used to, or I get used to, the application of this. So I see life in some ways as a practice of building strength and adversity. I remember this quote that used to say, now I'm kind of blanking on it, but something about in the midst of fear, there's equal chance. In the midst of adversity, there's equal chance to grow the opportunity that's there for your own strengths. But so that's what you're doing, and that reframe that you've genuinely integrated has allowed you to do these practices in your life and see stress as an opportunity. These are kind of many stressful, or these, and which stems to relationships, which stems to your physical body, which really ultimately gives you a sense of personal autonomy and agency and control. And allows you to do what I think a lot of people have a difficult time doing. And that's why I love the idea of your book and what you're bringing out there, because it gives us a hope and a pathway to begin to break our barriers, I guess, both emotional and physical barriers, for our own health and longevity. Did I have that right?
You got it, man. You're good. Yeah, I mean, the famous Nietzsche quote, or some people attribute it to Kelly Clarkson, depending on your cultural anchoring, but, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? So, you know, the most obvious example of that is, with muscle hypertrophy. So we lift something really, really heavy a bunch of times. And what happens? So like the microfibers in our biceps might tear. And then what does the body do? It has this wonderful adaptive response to that, where it starts to stimulate the production of these little structural proteins, myosin and actin, et cetera, and give it enough rest and eat enough protein or whatever, and the muscle grows back bigger, right? You go back stronger. And, that concept is protein that's applicable to a lot of our areas of our life. And I think, we really don't want a life of endless, incessant ease. When we really get honest with ourselves about it, I mean, yeah, it's delicious to curl up on the couch in a nice 72-degree environment and binge Netflix with a pint of chubby hubby. I won't say that I haven't done that. That is on occasion delicious, right? And a delicious experience. But that's not really the life that we're looking for. That's not the ease that we're truly craving in life. You know, we know ease when we taste it almost. Sometimes I think about it this way. It's like when you taste a tomato that you grew in your backyard, that tastes a lot different than the ethylene gas tomato that you bought at Stop and Shop. Um, but of course, in order to grow that, you had to cultivate that soil and tend it and plant the seed and prune the leaves in a proper way and make sure it got enough water and enough sun such that eventually that you got it. And that's inconvenient. you know? But what's on the other side of this inconvenience is this absolutely fakened, efflorescent, sweet, wonderful, bursting tomato. And this is also true in our own life. You know, we're here, Elisha, like having this really connective conversation. It's like both collective enterprise and deeply creative, and it feels really easy. But this is the ease we're actually looking for. Like sometimes I get a glimpse or a taste of it when I'm playing tennis, where I have like absolute full awareness of my body and space and time. Linear time starts to sort of dissipate. I'm kind of outside of the fluctuations of location and form. I'm just completely all there. I'm yoking action and intention. And sometimes
Right.
we label that flow state or play, but that is the true ease that we're really seeking. And that doesn't always come for free. You know, that we have to lean into the edges of our discomfort. I'm not saying go in and jump into a 33-degree ice bath. We just lean into the edges of it and we grow our resilience and we grow our ability to deal with adversity in those moments. We essentially just enhance our ability to constantly find this tenuous, dynamic place on the universal teeter-totter where, you know, no one's feet are touching the ground, if you will.
Yeah. Sometimes I tell people along these lines, be on the lookout in the day for where you notice your body bracing. That's one of those moments. And if you can see that as an opportunity versus a just unconsciously going into a loop in some way, then you get to do what you're talking about. It's like a little micro shift of building. You get to build. It's like an opportunity to break free from in some negativity bias, implicit driver type thing that might be unhealthy for you. And now you can kind of move into a place of greater health.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, I wanna respect your time. I'm so grateful for you creating the space and time to be with us, and for everything you're doing over at One Commune and your Commune podcast, and just these incredible things, and these books and everything you're putting out there, and all the really content in a really good way for the benefit of um, us and the world. If listeners can take away one thing from this conversation, if we could kind of bring this at full circle, what would you want it to be?
Yeah, I think that the one thing I really, really want people to understand is that change is possible, that upward spirals in your psychological and physiological health are there for you, and that you can rewrite your story and live a full, vibrant, efflorescent life. I mean, really, the question that I try to ask myself that I want everyone to ask themselves today is in this brief miraculous, wonderful life that you have, how brightly will you shine in this moment? Um, and and I think that is a hopeful and optimistic message.
Yeah. And with the right education and support, like the work that you're putting out, intentionally attending to that, then that could be a scaffolding that can help keep this top of mind to be able to move in that direction.
Mm.
Tell us a little bit about where people can also find more about you and what you're doing so they can access even more from what we're doing from this podcast.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that opportunity. And again, it's wonderful to connect with you. Yeah, I managed to scoop up the URL goodstress.com. So if you want to,
Oh,
yeah, if you want to dive into the protocols these sort of amalgam of different praxis that I've been able to harvest from, all of the incredible people I've been around and interviewed, etc., you can go there, goodstress.com, and order my book. And, I'm fortunate enough to be able to bundle in all sorts of unbelievable bonuses and goodies there with courses from all sorts of amazing integrative and functional medicine doctors and other mindfulness and yoga leaders, etc. So goodstress.com. And then, yeah, onecommune.com. That's the Commune platform that, you can go and discover really the bounty of all of these amazing teachers. So that's ONE commune.com. And yeah, I wax alternately poetic and pathetic on the old Instagram at Jeff Krasno. So those are the places that you can find me.
okay. All right. Everyone go check them out. Thank you so much, Jeff. Once again, deep respect for everything that you're doing, and I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks, Elisha.
Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Emotional Longevity Podcast. I hope you found it as inspiring and thought-provoking as I did. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to hit like down below, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone you know who could benefit from these insights. Your support helps us grow this incredible community and reach more people who need it. If today's conversation resonated with you and you're ready to go deeper, if you're ready to truly integrate these ideas into your life, I'd love to invite you to join me in a beautiful, supportive community that's doing this transformative work together. It's a space where you'll find guidance, connection, and the tools you need to create lasting emotional health and resilience. Check out the links in the description below to learn more. And before you go, make sure to tune into our next episode. It's one that you won't want to miss. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, emotional health isn't about just feeling good. It's about building the foundation for a longer, healthier, and more joyful life. I'll see you soon.